record this meeting so that I can share it with some of our colleagues who aren't able to come today. And let's see, I'm going to introduce Eleanor. Before I do that, I just had a couple of housekeeping things. I don't know, actually, I did want to give just a quick overview of MLP, just for those of you who may not be familiar with Medical Legal Partnership. We do provide free legal services to low-income patients and families across the health system to address social determinants of health that are rooted in legal problems and have a remedy in civil law. So we provide free legal services in many different areas, including housing, family law, estate planning, public benefits, including Medicaid, which we're going to talk about today, immigration, special education, consumer and employment law. So I'm not going to go into detail about these areas because I want to make sure Eleanor has enough time for her presentation. But please feel free to email me directly or mlp@vcuhealth.org with any questions about MLP or how to make a referral to us today. So without further delay, I want to introduce Eleanor and ask you to also just put all of your questions in the chat and I'll monitor that, and then I'll find a good time to ask Eleanor to answer those questions, or I'll wait until the end. I also did just want to mention that Sarah Blows has joined us today. I know many of you know Sarah. She's our amazing Chore MLP attorney. And many of you have worked with Sarah, and you know that she wears a lot of hats today, in addition to serving as a managing attorney and director of health advocacy at Central Virginia Legal Aid Society. She's currently working on site at the Health Hub one day per week and serving the residents of the East End. And Sarah is also available for questions during the session, especially if you have questions of law or specifically about handling Medicaid appeals. So Eleanor, thank you so much for presenting on Medicaid eligibility today. Eleanor is a healthcare navigator with Enroll Virginia and the Central Virginia Legal Aid Society. She previously worked as a Department of Justice accredited legal representative practicing immigration law on behalf of low-income refugee and immigrant families. She also has experience in adult education, piloting a citizenship instruction program for Catholic Charities and serving for a year in AmeriCorps. So Eleanor is uniquely qualified to present on this topic, and particularly on Medicaid eligibility for mixed status families. And she's been a great resource to us in MLP, and we're just delighted that she's willing to share her knowledge and expertise today. So Eleanor, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and you should be able to share your screen.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eleanor. I'm going to spend the morning talking to you about what immigration statuses will qualify people living here in Virginia for Medicaid. It is a dense topic, dense enough that you tend to see errors sometimes from departments of social services, which is another reason that's important for anybody helping these families apply for Medicaid coverage, to know who should be eligible and who should not be eligible. So please, like I said, it's a dense topic. So anytime you have a question, please pop it in the chat, or raise your hand, whatever you want to do. Feel free to interrupt me in order to get those questions answered. With that being said, I'll go ahead and share my slides and see if everybody can see them. All right, can everybody see that?
I am not seeing that.
Okay, let's see. All right. Now are people able to see that?
Yes, we can see them.
Fantastic. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. The agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about Medicaid eligibility in different categories. We're going to talk about Medicaid eligibility for adults, for children who are under 19, for pregnant individuals, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to recognize immigration documents, because if you're working with mixed status families, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at work permits and USCIS receipts, and it's helpful to know what you're looking at and what they mean. So Virginia Medicaid categories, I'm sure everybody is somewhat familiar already with Virginia Medicaid, but Virginia Medicaid has several different programs. And immigration eligibility for those programs really sort of groups some of those programs together into these three big chunks. So you have certain immigrant rules for children who are under 19. Those would be children that fall under the Famous Plus and Famous Kids program. And for anybody that's not familiar with those programs have slightly different income eligibility and different requirements for whether or not you can have private insurance. Virginia also has 3 different programs for pregnant people: Medicaid for pregnant women, Famous Moms, Prenatal Famous. And eligibility for those categories, income controls for that somewhat, private insurance eligibility, and immigration status. And then finally, we have Medicaid for adults. We have Medicaid expansion, which just means the Medicaid for adults program that the state of Virginia launched in the beginning of 2019. And then we have the Medicaid for the age, blind, and disabled. So we're going to talk about each of these categories one by one, since the rules do differ quite a bit. As a general rule of thumb, if you're working with mixed status families, something very useful to know is that the rules for children and the rules for pregnant people are much less restrictive than the Medicaid for adults. The Medicaid for adults is really very particular and very finicky, but that is not the case for the kids and for anybody that is pregnant. So we'll go ahead and begin with the most finicky category and get it over with. Immigrant eligibility, first rule of thumb, is the same for anybody over 19. So whether or not you fall under that Medicaid expansion, maybe you're a working adult of 35, or you fall into the age, blind, and disabled, maybe you're 70, immigrant eligibility is the same for all of those folks. Like I said already, it is restricted to very specific immigration statuses once you hit 19. There are also, to make it even more complicated, there are slightly different rules before and after August 22nd of 1996. So if you're working with an individual that entered the United States after 1996, you'll follow a slightly narrower band of Medicaid eligibility. And if you're working with people that came to the US before August 22, 1996, those rules are slightly more generous. As a rule of thumb, almost anybody you're going to work with is going to fall into that post-1996 category. And the reason we have this split is that Congress passed a law tightening eligibility at that time. So, immigrant eligibility for adults, and these are specifically for people that entered after 1996, i.e. the majority of folks that you're going to be working with. So the first category of people that are eligible are refugees. And when I say refugees, that is a very specific legal status. These are people that had to flee their country due to war, persecution, some other sort of civil conflict. They were processed abroad by the United Nations. They were screened by the Department of Homeland Security, and then they were allowed to enter the United States, specifically in refugee status. You will find that some people will tell you that they're refugees because they culturally or politically consider themselves refugees. But that does not necessarily mean that the United States admitted them as such. Only somebody that was admitted as a refugee and has that paperwork is eligible for Medicaid. We also have asylees, people that have been granted asylum in the United States. Asylum is somewhat similar to refugee status in that these are individuals that were persecuted in their home countries. The difference is that they have applied for legal status here in the United States and go through an extremely long and extremely torturous legal process to get that status. One important thing for adults is that if you apply for asylum, that application can pend for years and years and years. Only people that are approved for asylum status as adults are able to get Medicaid. The other really big category, and this might be the majority of people that you work with, are lawful permanent residents, known colloquially as green card holders. However, there are a couple of restrictions here as well. For most green card holders, they're only able to get Medicaid if they've had that green card for 5 years or more. The only exception is somebody who is now a green card holder that transitioned to a green card status from a previous asylum or refugee status. Those folks will remain eligible for Medicaid throughout. Another common one that you'll see in Richmond, because Richmond actually has a couple of refugee resettlement agencies, is you'll see Afghani or Iraqi special immigrant visa holders. And what that is that's a green card status for Afghanis and Iraqis who cooperated with US forces when we were occupying those countries. So you see a lot of interpreters, a lot of translators, and they have been targeted in those countries on account of their cooperation with the US. And so the United States has brought them here to keep them safe. Folks that have that status are immediately eligible for Medicaid. Another group of people, of adults that are eligible for Medicaid, and a lot of this is actually very, very new and responding to current political events. Parolees of at least 1 year are eligible for Medicaid. A parolee is just somebody that has approached the US border and has been allowed to enter legally and can apply to get a work permit. Most of the people you're going to see in this category are going to be Ukrainians. The United States government created a special rule for Ukrainians who are paroled into the United States between February 24 of this year, which will extend all the way through September of 2023. If those folks are Ukrainian, they were paroled, and they entered between those dates, they are eligible for Medicaid. They're sort of their own very special category. The same applies to Afghani parolees. Afghani families that were paroled into the United States after the US pulled out of Afghanistan last year, and who entered the US between the end of July of 2021 and the end of September of this year, also have this special temporary category of Medicaid eligibility and are also able to get Medicaid if they're income eligible. The last status on this slide are adults who have been granted withholding of removal. This is a status that is similar to asylum. Somebody has to show that they would be persecuted in their home country if they were to return. But these people weren't able to meet the somewhat more stringent requirements of asylum. And so withholding of removal is another status they can get that's a little less beneficial. But those folks are also Medicaid eligible as adults. The last slide of eligibility for adults, and these are people that you're not going to see very often, but they have to be mentioned. There's a very, very special eligibility category for citizens who are from the Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia. They don't need to have any other underlying immigration status. They can just show a birth certificate or a passport for those countries, and they should be able to get Medicaid. Cuban and Haitian entrants. Due to some very special laws that passed Congress years ago, Cubans and Haitians that have been paroled, that have been applied for asylum, or even that are in removal or deportation proceedings are able to get Medicaid as adults as well. And then we also have trafficking victims with T visas, somebody who has been a victim of trafficking and has cooperated with the FBI or another law enforcement agency. If they have that visa approved, they're also able to get Medicaid. It's fairly rare that you're going to see that, but it does sometimes happen. So then a very quick note for immigrant eligibility for adults who entered before 1996. Again, these aren't going to be the majority of people that you work with, but you will see them from time to time. There are several rules here, but there are really only 3 that you're ever going to possibly see. The most common one will be the lawful permanent residents, those green card holders. If somebody has a green card and they entered the United States before that date in 1996, they can get Medicaid immediately. So remember that adults who entered the US after 1996, they have this 5-year waiting period as green card holders before they're eligible. That doesn't apply to these folks that have been in the US for 25 plus years. So there's a very slight advantage there. Other individuals that would be eligible if they came to the US before 1996 would be people with an approved VAWA petition. VAWA is short for Violence Against Women Act. These are petitions for people that have been abused by a US citizen family member and have gotten legal status that way. And then you also have conditional entrance. That's a status like refugees. They had to come to the United States before 1980, and I would be absolutely shocked if you found anybody like that. The group to look out for here are really the green card holders who entered before 96, who can get Medicaid at any time. All right, so we are now going to move on to, before I move on, does anybody have questions about any of this? Anything that All right, I'll go ahead and move on to status for children. But again, feel free to interrupt me, put a question in the chat, raise your hand, whatever you want to do at any point.
Eleanor, I do have a quick question about withholding of removal. Is that process just as long as the asylum process? Like, are those applications taking just as long?
Absolutely, they are. So withholding of removal is only a status that you can get if you are actively in deportation proceedings. That's only a status you get through the immigration court. And the immigration court moves very slowly. So yeah, if somebody applies for withholding of removal, I would expect it to be a couple of years at least before they have that status approved.
And is that, what kind of timelines are you seeing now for asylum and withholding of removal? Just a couple of years?
I mean, it depends. When I left practicing immigration law at the end of 2020, I was seeing waiting lists that looked more like 4, 5, 6 years.
Wow.
So yeah, these are lengthy. And that was at the beginning of COVID. Immigration stopped processing cases for a while. So I can only imagine that the case backlogs are even worse.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I'll go ahead and talk about immigrant eligibility for children under 19. This is very different. This is a completely different ball game than adults. And it's much more generous for kids than it is for adults, thankfully. As a general rule of thumb, most children that are here lawfully residing are able to qualify for Medicaid if, of course, they're income eligible and all of that. So for example, the lawful permanent residents, the kids with green cards, they're eligible immediately. That 5-year bar that applies to adults has nothing to do with kids. You do sometimes see departments of social services that don't know this. So it's sometimes something that advocates have to push, but it is the case. Also, children that have a visa that is not expired, they're also able to get Medicaid. Some of the most common examples is you'll see minors here with student visas. You'll see children here on exchange visas. You might see children here whose parents are on work visas and the kids have a derivative visa. As long as the visa is unexpired, the kid can get Medicaid. There is an exception for visitor visas. People that are here on tourist visas cannot get Medicaid because you're supposed to be here only visiting. Children that are refugees, children that are asylees, children that have temporary protected status, which is a status that the US government grants to nationals of countries that have recently had a national disaster. Special immigrant juvenile status, that's a special status granted by immigration courts to children that have been considered abandoned or abused in their home countries and have arrived in the USA. That withholding of removal status again, the trafficking visas, there's really a long list that'll make children eligible. A big rule that's important is, unfortunately, the DACA recipients are not eligible. So if you've heard of the Dreamers, Dreamers are not eligible for Medicaid, either as adults or as children. So keep that rule in mind.
Eleanor,
Yes,
do you see that question in the chat from
I
Marisa?
do. Yeah, it looks like there's a question about abuse of children in the home country. Sure. Do you want to clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so I had on the previous slide said something about, I forget the bullet, but the being abused in their home country. Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Okay, so personally, I have several kids on my caseload who, the program I work for, we case manage medically complex children.
Mhm.
And I have several kids on my caseload who have come to this country based on their home country physicians saying that they are not going to treat them anymore, and that they, would rather them pass away than to get the treatment that they
Yikes.
need. And so these kids obviously are not Medicaid eligible based on documentation that they have. So would that almost, but I don't know how you would prove that, but is that could that be under that umbrella of the abuse of children in their home, or not really?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
That's the special immigrant juvenile status is very specific.
Okay.
It's worth trying to speak to an immigration attorney to see if they're eligible for that status anyway, just because a lot of minors that come from Central America are, but that status specifically is set up for children where the juvenile court in the United States has decided that one of their parents has either abandoned them or abused them.
Oh, it's more for the, okay.
Yeah, it's really from the perspective of at least one parent has abandoned or abused them. So the JDR court here in the United States makes that determination that it's not that they've been abandoned or abused by a parent, and it's not in their best interest to return to the US. And then an immigration attorney can in turn take that JDR ruling and apply for that special immigrant juvenile status.
And so would both parents need to be in the United States, or could have one parent brought the child here and the other parent be in the other country to go through that?
It will disqualify you. If you have a whole family with two parents living with you, you categorically cannot get that status.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the kids I've seen who with the status are orphaned, or really commonly the mother is the sole caretaker and the child has been abandoned or abused by the father.
Okay.
And the father is likely not living with the family, or they're back in the home country. That's the most common situation that I'll see.
Okay.
So if you have kids in that situation, you really want to be referring to an immigration attorney so that they can do a screening to see if they're eligible for that special immigrant juvenile status, or for asylum, or any other immigration remedy that they might have. But unfortunately, any of that medical stuff will not help you in immigration proceedings whatsoever. The US is pretty brutal about that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Eleanor. There are a couple of other questions in the chat. Sophie has a question about DACA. Sophie, do you want to ask that question?
Yes, hi. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. I've been having trouble with my computer, but essentially when it comes to DACA, can you elaborate as to during that time, why DACA individuals don't qualify for Medicaid when they're under the age of 19? I think I got a little bit confused.
The short answer is politics. That's it. That's what it is. I think just because DACA was a new status that has been under attack, government regulations have limited the benefits of DACA because of those political considerations. So very unfortunately, and there are advocacy groups working to change this, but very unfortunately, adults and children with DACA don't qualify for any public insurance program, not Medicaid, not even the marketplace. Pretty brutal.
And Eleanor, we have one other question from Robin asking, I think I know the answer to this question, but if we have a kid who arrived in the US at 17, but then was diagnosed with a chronic illness at 19, does Medicaid use the under 18 requirements since that's when they arrived in the US, or do they treat them like an adult since they're applying for Medicaid at 19?
If they're applying for the age you are when you apply is what controls. So unfortunately, if the individual is already 19, they're already considered an adult and they're in that more restrictive category. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Unfortunately. Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody have anything else they want to go ahead and check in with before we start talking more about kids? All right, I'll go ahead and keep going, but again, feel free to interrupt me at any point. So another very important thing that's different between the children and the adults is that some children who have just a pending application for legal status will qualify for Medicaid. And this is something that you'll see, unfortunately. It's a little more complex, and so you sometimes see DSS offices get this very wrong. But this is what you'll see the most. You will see children that are asylum applicants, and a lot of times they're dependents on a parent's asylum application. So they're considered to be derivatives where they're part of a family application. If the children are on an asylum application and the asylum application has been pending for at least 6 months, those kids are Medicaid eligible. And this is a pretty big category of people because Richmond and Virginia have a lot of asylum applicants living here. And you can prove that to DSSs either by receipts for the asylum application that show that the application has been pending for 6 months, or if the kids have a work permit, you can use that, and that should be a pretty easy approval. The other applicant statuses that will qualify a kid for Medicaid is an applicant for, again, that special immigrant juvenile status, an applicant for temporary protected status that already has a work permit, and under very, very particular circumstances, kids that have applied for green cards within the US and already have a family petition approved can also get Medicaid. But those are going to be very special circumstances.
And Eleanor, I'll just add to that too, that MLP has a few immigration cases pending now for asylum for kids, and we have been successful with that 6-month rule, and we've been able to get Medicaid, particularly for kids who need life-saving treatment. So we have a couple of right now who need kidney transplants, and we're able to get them Medicaid. And we like to try to get those applications filed when we know that down the road, the kid is going to need that transplant while they're on dialysis so that we can make sure Medicaid's in place before they need it. In those situations, those children and families have had a good faith claim for asylum, and McGuire Woods has taken those cases for us. So if you have cases like that, please reach out. We may be able to help with those.
Great. Wonderful, yeah. All right, so then we're going to move on to eligibility for pregnant people, and this is happily by far the broadest category. So starting in July of 2021, there is no longer an immigration status requirement for pregnant people. Anybody from an undocumented woman to a US citizen who's pregnant and meets the income requirements can qualify for Medicaid, which is fantastic. However, you do want to always still accurately report immigration status and submit documents. And the reason for this is some of the retroactive and postpartum benefits differ depending on your Medicaid category. So for example, if you're a woman who is lawfully residing, and that list looks exactly the same as the list for kids, maybe you have a green card, maybe you have temporary protected status, Maybe you have a visa that's unexpired. If you're in any of those lawful statuses, you can get either Medicaid for pregnant women or famous moms, depending on your income. And the difference is that if you are in one of those two categories, lawfully residing, Medicaid for pregnant women, or famous moms, you can now have postpartum coverage for up to a year, which is a great benefit. So if a woman has that status, you want to show it so that she can have coverage a lot longer. If you are working with a mother who is undocumented, that mother can still get Medicaid as long as she is under 205% of the federal poverty level and doesn't have private insurance. The difference is that she can only, the mother or the pregnant individual can only have Medicaid for up to 2 months of postpartum coverage, and there's no retroactive coverage. With some of these other categories, you can have the 3 months retroactive coverage if you qualify and cover some of those past bills. So for the undocumented mothers, the window in which you can have Medicaid is a little narrower. So again, you do want to accurately report those statuses and submit those immigration documents to DSS. Max out people's coverage times. Are there any more questions about immigrant eligibility before we move into how to look at documents? All right, so I'll go ahead and talk about documents, but again, interrupt me if anybody has questions.
I'm sorry. This is Emily. I couldn't get off mute fast enough. I had a question about public charge. How much? Maybe I came in a little late. Maybe you've already discussed that, but many families will tell me that they've been told that they can't apply because of the public charge.
Yeah, so good question. In general, for anybody that doesn't know, public charge is an old immigration rule. It actually dates back to Ellis Island, stating that if a family is likely to need support from the US government, they can't get a green card or other immigration benefits. And the way that this is implemented today is generally that if a family is on a cash benefit, like TANF, it can disqualify them in the future from having a green card. It's really, in general, the general rule with public charge is if you are eligible to get Medicaid, you're almost never going to fall afoul of public charge because you have to be exempt from public charge to get Medicaid to begin with. It's the people that public charge affects are people who are generally already not eligible for Medicaid. However, you do see a lot of fear among immigrant communities about public charge. And part of that is because the prior administration did implement rules around public charge, trying to make them more stringent. And that really scared folks away who are actually eligible for those benefits and are just too afraid to take advantage of it. I would also say that there are some immigration attorneys that don't understand public charge well. But what you can tell people, and if you have clients that are afraid of this and you'd like me to send you primers or other sort of explanation documents, in general, Medicaid only triggers public charge if you need long-term care. So regular Medicaid will not trigger public charge. And even in the prior administration, children and pregnant people were still exempt from that Medicaid public charge rule. So I think, Emily, almost anybody you work with, if they qualify for Medicaid, they don't need long-term care, they're okay with public charge. Right now, the only exception would be the Ukrainian and the Afghani nationals, parolees who have gotten Medicaid, and then they have a family member petition for them. That could run them afoul of public charge. My hope and guess is that probably Congress will pass a law to make them public charge exempt because they're already being treated as if they're refugees in terms of some of the resettlement benefits and public benefits. But those are really the only people that have to think about a Medicaid application whatsoever in terms of public charge. Everybody else really should be okay. There's just a lot of misinformation and fear that has been circulated among immigrant communities.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for that question, because we do get a lot of questions about this. So, and Kathleen has asked a follow-up question in the chat about this, and she's also asked, Eleanor, if you could include those documents about public charge. So maybe when you send me your slides, if you could send me those documents, I can share those with the group. But Kathleen is asking if a family uses SNAP benefits, does that create a problem for the public, for public charge?
Nope, it does not. Now they're also probably not going to be eligible for SNAP benefits. I think unless I don't know SNAP rules well, but SNAP is more restrictive with immigration status than Medicaid. So a lot of people wouldn't be eligible for SNAP, but no, having SNAP does not trigger public charge. It's not a cash benefit.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then was there another question in the chat?
No.
Okay, great. All right, great questions. And yes, I will send you some of those public charge sheets. And I'll try to find some in English and some in Spanish for you.
Yes, thank you. I think my families don't really believe me when I tell them that Medicaid, that it's not going to affect them if they get Medicaid, that they're listening to their immigration attorney, understandably.
Yeah, no, and unfortunately, a lot of the immigration attorneys don't know public charge terribly well either. And it's just easier to tell people to stay off of public benefits than it is to actually parse those rules.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I run into the same problem as well. That's why it's handy to have sheets and to have resources sometimes that come directly from the government. So I'll send you some of those USCIS fact sheets as well, just for legitimacy, just so you can show families this comes directly from the United States immigration body.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Just make a note of that really quickly.
And Eleanor, we do have another question in the chat. From Maureen. She says she has undocumented residents who have been to in the US for more than 20 years and have a social security number. Would they be able to qualify for Medicaid? And what about undocumented patients who have a work permit? Do they qualify for Medicaid?
So it all depends on the actual specific status. So if you're working with somebody that has a social security number, you would need to ask them what their specific immigration status is. You know, do they have temporary protected status? Are they an asylum applicant? Do they have a green card? You know, what is their actual situation? You would probably have to ask questions and ask to look at documentation to dig deeper. And then you would be able to match whatever they say sort of against the list I've given you. For people who have work permits, if you have a valid work permit, you're not undocumented, but a work permit, you arrived probably just a couple slides before me. A work permit is a benefit that accrues to dozens, maybe even hundreds of underlying statuses. So a work permit doesn't mean anything in and of itself. You would have to see, what does the work permit come from? Do you have a work permit because you're an asylum applicant? Do you have a work permit because you're here as a refugee? Do you have a work permit through DACA? You'd have to actually look at the underlying status and see if the underlying status would make you eligible for Medicaid. So for example, if you had a patient who had a DACA work permit, we know DACA is ineligible for everything, unfortunately. If you had a patient who has a work permit because their asylum application was approved, that person should be eligible for Medicaid. So that's one of those situations where you're going to have to do some digging and look at documentation. And I'm about to teach you how to do that right now. That's where I think things get complex, both for advocates and for DSS offices. So I have a section here where I'm trying to show you some samples. Because yeah, it does, it's dense, like I said. So great segue, actually. A lot of times, if somebody wants to apply for Medicaid, I ask to see their documentation. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is that almost always DSS offices want to see it as well. And you're going to have to submit it either way. So you might as well have it right off the bat. The second reason is a lot of times people aren't always able to accurately report their immigration statuses. And this is for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is a lot of immigration attorneys don't sufficiently explain to people what status they have or what they're applying for, unfortunately. The second reason is something I mentioned earlier, which is that you have some people that might have cultural or political reasons for giving you a status, but they don't actually have that legal status. So for example, I've worked with a lot of Venezuelans who will come into meetings and tell me that they are refugees. And they mean that they are refugees in the sense that they left Venezuela because the economic and political conditions there were dire. But they didn't come into the United States government did not accept them as refugees. They came to the United States on visitor visas. They came to the United States undocumented. They came to the United States maybe on a work visa. So that's one of the reasons that I also asked to see immigration documents, is a lot of times people have reasons for giving you the status they do. And sometimes it's more for those cultural reasons than anything else. So best practice is to check, always. And the types of immigration documents you're going to look at, you're usually going to be looking at lawful permanent resident cards, green cards. You're going to be looking at those work permits, which are known formally as employment authorization documents. You're going to look at United States Citizenship and Immigration Services receipts for applications. And you'll be occasionally looking at I-94s, which are records of lawful entry into the US. So the first document you're going to be looking at are going to be lawful permanent resident cards, also known as green cards. And green cards have changed throughout the years. You can see a lovely array here of how they looked back in the 70s up to now. You can actually potentially still see green cards from the 70s, and that's because lawful permanent resident status does not actually expire. And this is sometimes another fight that I will have with DSS. The card itself expires and has to be renewed, but the underlying status does not. Permanent status is permanent status. Lawful permanent resident status only terminates if somebody's placed in removal or deportation proceedings, if they stay outside of the United States for over a year, or they voluntarily renounce their green card. So somebody with an expired green card could actually, unless they meet one of those circumstances above, if somebody has an expired green card, they could still be eligible for Medicaid. What the DSS caseworker has to do is run the numbers on the green card in their system, and they should be able to verify that the underlying status is still valid. So that's a very important distinction. A couple of tips if you're working with Afghanis, Iraqis, if you're working with people who are formerly refugees or asylees. Sometimes those people have green cards rather than their refugee or asylee status if they've been in the US a little bit longer. Once you have been a refugee or an asylee in the US with that status for a year, you can apply for a green card. But that's important for you to know because, you know, normally the green card holders can only get Medicaid if they've had the green card for 5 years. But the refugees and asylees are sort of grandfathered in. They can get that Medicaid immediately. So you want to be able to know if somebody is a green card holder that used to have a refugee or asylee status. So you can actually look at the categories on these green cards to figure that out. So if you see somebody who has a green card with the category of SQ, you know they're an Iraqi or an Afghani, and they're eligible for Medicaid regardless of those dates. If you look at somebody's green card and its category is RE or AS, they're a refugee or an asylee previously, they're eligible for Medicaid immediately. So just an important tip. And then moving into employment authorization documents. These are also known as informally as work permits, and you'll have a lot of people tell you that they have work permits. These are what some of the iterations look like. A work permit allows people to legally work in the United States and to have a social security number. But like I mentioned earlier with Maureen's question, it's not a status in and of itself. Employment authorization is a benefit that flows from a lot of different underlying statuses. So temporary protected status, if you've been an asylum applicant, you can get this work permit. You can get a work permit with DACA. All kinds of things would give you a work permit. A good rule is that many, but not all children under 19 with these work permits will qualify for Medicaid. And some of the limited adult Medicaid statuses will also have employment authorizations. So your refugees are going to have work permits. Your approved asylees are going to have work permits. Your individuals with withholding of removal will have work permits. So a work permit is a really important place for you to start, but that's not where you end with a Medicaid eligibility screening. Where you end is you have to figure out what on earth the work permit means. And you do that again by looking at the category. So there's a category code that appears on all work permits, and you can look at that category code and see the underlying status. So for example, somebody that has a category code C08 is an asylum applicant. Well, then you know that if they're a kid under 19 and they're an asylum applicant with that work permit, Medicaid eligible. Fantastic. If you have somebody with a category A5, that's somebody that has an approved asylum application. Your kids and your adults, equally Medicaid eligible. Category C11 for parolees. Category A12 is going to be for temporary protected status. So this is, work permits sort of come with their own little cheat sheet, and you can use that to figure out somebody's underlying status. The 4 that I put on here are 4 of the most common ones you're going to see. But if you need to match a category to a status, you can go to this link down at the bottom. Whoops. You can go to the link down at the bottom. That's the instructional sheet for a work permit application. And you can find the codes, the category codes for every possible status. So that's sort of like having a cheat sheet. So Maureen, back to your question, if somebody has a work permit, are they Medicaid eligible? This is how you figure that out. You would look at the work permit, you'd figure out the category, you'd match the category on that document and determine the status from there. So the next documents you're going to see, you could occasionally see I-94s. These are US arrival records. You're going to see these most often with your parolees. And the class of admission is here at the bottom. So for example, if somebody's class of admission down here says B1 or B2, you know they're a visitor, they're a tourist, and they're not eligible. If you see a D5, you know they're a parolee, may be eligible. And you can actually retrieve the I-94s for people online, which is useful. And then lastly, there are receipts. Whenever somebody applies for an immigration status, the US government issues them a receipt and it says when they applied, what their name is, and what status they applied for. And you can also sometimes use those. You're going to use this most often for people who have applied for asylum and they have a kid under 19. And once you hit that 6-month mark, the kid's eligible for Medicaid. The receipt is really handy for stuff like that because it shows the date and it shows that asylum is what they applied for. These are probably things you already know, but generally when I submit an application for somebody that's a non-citizen, I submit their immigration documents proactively because DSS always comes back and asks for them. So I'll submit documents by email to cover Virginia. You can submit documents directly by email to Henrico and Chesterfield. Again, that's something that I do proactively at the beginning of an application, just to keep DSSs from asking for those documents and delaying cases. Another general note, a final note, is that immigrant eligibility for marketplace health insurance is usually broader than for Medicaid. So some individuals, especially adults barred from Virginia Medicaid, could qualify for a marketplace plan. So that's always something to look into or to make a referral for. Just because they're not eligible for Medicaid doesn't mean they're barred from the marketplace. They could still get affordable insurance. And I think that's it. That's all I've got today. Does anybody have any other questions about eligibility, about how to read documents? Anything I've taught public charge, anything we've talked about today?
Eleanor, I am curious about the eligibility requirements for the marketplace versus Medicaid. And you don't need to go into great detail, but can you summarize generally what makes someone eligible for the marketplace who wouldn't be eligible for Medicaid?
Yeah, so marketplace rules don't exactly mimic the Medicaid rules for kids under 19, but they're really close. So as a general rule of thumb, you can qualify for the marketplace if you're lawfully residing of any kind. There are a couple of the same exceptions. DACA's out entirely, unfortunately. People with visitors visas are out. But generally, any other lawful status should qualify you for marketplace coverage if you're otherwise eligible. So it is much broader, and you have some of the same applicant rules for marketplace as you do for kids Medicaid. So, again, kids who have had an asylum application pending for 6 months can get Medicaid. Adults with a pending asylum application that already have their work permit can get marketplace. So that's a big one. I help a lot of kids in that situation. Yeah, no, it is. A lot of times I have families come to me and I end up putting the parents in a marketplace plan and the kids in Medicaid who are in that situation. So that's a really important category to keep in mind.
That's great. Thank you. That's super helpful. Any other questions for Eleanor? We did have, we had a couple of comments in the chat that everyone would like the slides. So we will make sure that we send those out along with the public charge documents that you talked about and the recording. So we will make sure we send these to all of you who participated today. Any final questions for Eleanor? We do have just a couple more minutes.
Eleanor, thank you so much. I have another question about a child that could potentially get the CCC Plus waiver. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. I mean, they have to have Medicaid eligibility, but it's a way to not look at the parent's income.
I don't work with those programs, but as far as I know, the immigration requirements are the same.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, do you know anything about SSI approval for a child that has a green card? There's a time limit on that, 5 or 10 years or something. Okay.
Haven't the foggiest.
But you know a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
everything you shared. Thank you.
Yeah, and Sarah, not to put you on the spot, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the SSI question or the CCC Plus waiver. I know you do some work in that area.
Yeah, I think Eleanor's right for CCC Plus. I think the citizenship status eligibility would not change, and then CCC Plus eligibility is going to be based on disability status. So once you meet the hurdle of being generally eligible, then if they're medically eligible for CCC Plus, then you're good to go. I don't know the answer on SSI, but my supervisor Sylvia might, because she handles children's SSI cases. So we can ask her, and then if she knows, or we can probably find out if she doesn't know, we could send that along with the materials and the recording.
Sarah.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Eleanor. This has been just fantastic, really detailed and helpful. And I think those slides will be very useful for all of us. So we appreciate your time, and I will be sending out the recording and the slides, hopefully within the next few days. So thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.